In the past decade, through the biggest American animation studios, there has been nothing but 3D movies from Disney, Pixar, DreamWorks, Sony, Illumination, and so forth. And despite some misses for some in recent years, overall their stories have been fantastic, where I hold a deep love for such films like Moana and so forth. Where most people know the reason I make these videos is out of the love I used to have for Disney, where creativity used to be blossoming out of the wazoo, where nowadays that does not seem to be the case anymore. And this is mainly to add on to the recent trailer that I talked about from Wish, celebrating 100 years of Disney with a new distinct style that leaves much to be desired from looking more like a TV show rather than an actual feature-length film. Now it is still too early to judge the looks of the movie, but there's just so much to talk about it, including the past and me wanting them to actually bring back 2D animation. To harken back to traditional animation that is sorely missed in every single studio today, where like I said, I don't mean to put down the quality that the other studios have been putting out in 3D, because they are also amazing and great and has tons of different styles like the Spider-Verse and whatnot, but we are truly missing the 2D style from all of them, except Pixar in that case. After all, looking at the history of studios like DreamWorks is one that used to have traditional 2D. It wasn't their very first film, but they had their first few do use that, like in classics like The Prince of Egypt, where then again they had a hit or miss attitude where Shrek realized that they should go against Pixar instead as the new primary 3D animation studio out there. Then of course you saw that happen with Disney and the infamous stories about tanking things like Treasure Planet because they wanted to dive into something new when they first made something like Chicken Little, where in that regard, we know how much that film sucked, like oh my god, this is what we got after such a classic that they butchered, where at the very least they would still make some 2D animation films like Princess and the Frog. Like in this case, this is a case compared to DreamWorks that Disney was still fully capable of making such classics in that style that ended on a high note that people actually still want today. There's just so much that they have to offer that hasn't been really explored, and we must look into the past to show a case for today in that regard of animation. I mean, regarding Disney primarily for this video, it wouldn't be the company it was today without its achievements throughout traditional animation that truly inspired almost everything we see today in regards to animation. This includes the technological leaps and bounds that Walt Disney always prided himself in doing no matter what way you look at it, where we can clearly see he started to use stuff like Technicolor in the Silly Symphonies, which of course ended up as a huge success that went even further into its stories, like the Three Little Pigs that actually was a big hit back in the day that showcased that you could use certain styles and actually fit it into a grand story like you would see on a regular live action screen, where that also translated back into Snow White. Now I've already mentioned a lot about this in my past about my criticisms of modern Disney and the history of the studio, so I will tend to keep it short, focusing on Snow White because of how beautiful it remains. A timeless piece where no matter how old it really seems, you overlook it because of the fact of what it did in film. The first full-length feature animated film that we actually see prevalent in society today, with many studios going into it, that has entertained everyone. It just seemed so beautiful and so real that I also will never forgive them for the fact that you decided to make a live action remake of this very film, which to me is taking away from that animation that was actually stylized and meant to be portrayed as real, because today you are just that greedy and ignorant of anything you built in your past, and it's solely disrespectful. But back to my main point, it was just that whole golden age of animation for Disney proved the ability that stories could be told in this way in this realm, where despite knowing what Walt would actually want to do moving on to 3D animation with his technological futurist mind, if he indeed lived to see it, there's just something magical about the world being portrayed in this very light, where they actually refuse to dive back in outside of TV productions and whatnot that we see today. And again, to put this more into perspective, this style of animation of course saved Disney through the likes of Cinderella, the movie that just likes to save Disney in all aspects if you think about it, whether it be sequels, their live action, you name it, where for some reason Cinderella does have this magical power when it comes to Disney saving itself, where of course before this point they had other animated projects which were all largely overshadowed by World War II hampering the studio, of course, where they just made a bunch of packaged films instead that had the so-and-so reputation, and of course the company was kind of low on funds, making this movie a make or break situation where it harkened back to that traditional style yet again that they found in Snow White, and they succeeded, and here we are today because of it. But here also remains a case to point out the beauty of what traditional animation brings, where I really recommend you watch something like The Reluctant Dragon, a film where comedian Robert Bentley finds himself trying to sell the rights of The Reluctant Dragon to Walt Disney, where he gets dragged into the animation process. Like, I really love this film in the beginning to use black and white, but then transitions to using color to showcase what they did in animation, where it makes you appreciate how much they actually did into making those various films. films. For example, you have scenes like the camera room that showed you the multi-plane camera, which was used to create depth when you were moving through the forest, and such, where they had Donald Duck actually explain the mechanics of animation, and then showing us things like the ink and paint department to show us the color process, the storyboard room, and of course my personal favorite in the movie with Ward Kimball showcasing him animating Goofy. Basically, it was a fun, goofy documentary on Walt Disney Animation Studios back in its early days that ended showing how Walt already worked on The Reluctant Dragon, where if you want to watch it, it is on Disney Plus, and you should really check that one out to see that historical animation process that I still hold dear today. And back to talking about Disney as a whole is how they kept doing this no matter how dark times would be in that department, where it almost looked like it ended at certain moments, but still constantly saved by things like The Little Mermaid bringing back the Renaissance that brings us more classic beloved Disney movies that most of us know today. Each of these stories feels so separate and unique that they're able to stand out on their own from each other no matter how good or bad they seem, and that's something I really liked from that certain style, and how you can derive one piece of the world or story when they did that compared to say the Disney of 2010 to 2022, where of course when you see that style it doesn't really feel like it's adding on to anything. They just feel more of the same when Frozen actually reused some of the same character models, namely Elsa and her mother, or having cameos by Rapunzel and Eugene, or you know, baby Moana and this girl and Ralph, to showcase how much they reuse and how much this style is stagnant in this certain type of realm that Disney was not known for originally. Where of course I do actually love these stories. I love the style that they have because some of them are really great films that I hold dear, like Tangled, Wreck-It Ralph, and of course Moana, still amongst my favorites along with the classics, unlike the other half of this era where that is a complete separate story and completely dog shit in my opinion. But it's just that when they did Tangled, they stopped using 2D after Princess and the Frog for some reason, where in fact they still succeeded compared to how DreamWorks actually didn't think they did after using Sinbad, which I'm still upset about because we had such great films come with them, especially The Road in El Dorado in my opinion, which still remains to be underrated to this day. Where I guess they just liked being goofy with the 3D, and that has actually worked for them ever since, where at the very least they still continue to use it in Kung Fu Panda, where I will give them that fact. And of course in films like Moana, they also did use the 2D style within Maui's tattoos, where they combine it very well using both 2D and 3D. But of course in this instance we're just more focused on 2D, where the very last instance of it was Disney's last major short, once again mentioned Paperman, like I did in my Wish video, a proper cel-shaded combination of traditional and 3D that I wish actually had used for the film from what I seen in the trailer. And if that's to say something at the very least, then maybe they should dig into that more style if they are so afraid. Or I'm just failing to comprehend why does Disney seem hell-bent on this very stagnating style for the past few years before this movie ever comes out. I mean, even despite the differences you can see in it, you can still tell they have a similar style to the other 3D animation they used from the ones before. Like seriously, what is stopping you from telling such unique stories in this style? I mean, I did a poll a while back about where would you like a new Disney film to take place, where most actually chose Japan, where they would also like a 2D animated film from there. Not to anime of course, but something more different and distinct in that style, in that very form, with a historical setting that could place them on the islands that we might want to see from them. I mean, they did stuff like that within Mulan, and of course The Emperor's New Groove as films that actually took place out of the norm of most stories or modern places like in pre-colonial South America or ancient China rather than Europe, for fairy tales or older settings to tell that. Like, what is actually stopping them from doing that now and doing something different or better for Southeast Asia rather than what Raya did, which was terrible by its messages mainly? Like, you can tell those kinds of stories in this style, and it would be awesome and unique to actually tell them with the type of animation you can produce from them. And this is also actually no excuse to tell a mediocre story by far, because if anything is to go by with the likes of Disney, their past few stories, except for a couple few, have really missed the mark. And if they were to go with that, especially in 2D, that would also be unforgivable and makes it forgettable with like what they did in the past with Atlantis and Treasure Planet. But of course, the main purpose of this video is to advocate for its usage in storytelling for all studios except Pixar, where of course in that case it really wouldn't feel right for them to tell stories with how they began, where that is what I love the most part about the early 2000s, with Pixar and Disney differentiating themselves for the most part of their historic relationship, where one did 2D and the other did 3D, if you know what I mean. The real thing I just want to drive in here is for them to not forget about who they were and who they are, especially 100 years later into the game. That celebration should harken back at least with bigger productions in a traditional form where yes, it might be longer and time consuming, but it still is art nonetheless. But of course, in this case, you don't really care for that, do you? Your countless remakes, especially the most recent Peter Pan film, has actually proven how much you don't value this medium of storytelling anymore, or even 3D for that matter with the announcement of Moana. Because in this day and age, you are that soulless, destroying everything that had to do with your own history, where it is truly unforgivable and recognizes the cheap greed of your very fucking mindset. But at least for the sake of everyone, just bring back this, because that would surely attract a wide audience with a style of stories that have already been told and loved for generations and will keep doing so for time's sake. You know you love to tell comic book stories through Marvel. Well, you had that sort of opportunity presented in Atlantis with that very style that was made similar to that of the creator of Hellboy and such, where you can actually feel that throughout the film, which cannot be done through 3D animation, unless you yourselves could also really choose to do the animation style of the Spider-Verse. But in this case, it's still advocating for the full usage of 2D instead for that type of story, where you can tell everything in 1,000 different ways if you just listen to us, and so could DreamWorks for that matter, or any other studio. Where I just find it hard to believe that for most of the big ones that are being released on screen this year, that doesn't count others around the world, have fully stick to this 3D style. Every single major studio trailer that features animation is strictly in that very 3D style, and it's very disappointing I haven't seen them go back to 2D. It's just that I really want to know other than time that prevents them from ever going back to doing so. Like, do you actually understand how much people love these characters and the way that they are? Or is it just in the case of Treasure Planet that you really think it's a dying form of storytelling that you're just too lazy to go back into? Like, I really want to know the answer to that question, and until that day comes, I guess I'll just have to wait, and that's all I really have to say. So I'm all done, so goodbye.